Picture this. It's 1934. You're 8 years old, sitting at a bare wooden table, watching your little sister eat the last piece of bread while your stomach growls. But you don't complain, because tomorrow is your day to eat, and she'll be the one watching. This isn't fiction. This is the reality millions of American families lived through during the Great Depression, when eating in shifts wasn't a restaurant policy, it was a survival strategy. What's up, history lovers? I'm back with another deep dive into America's past. And today we're uncovering stories that will absolutely blow your mind. We're talking about the Great Depression, but not the way your textbooks taught it. We're going inside American homes to discover how ordinary families survived the unthinkable. You think you know about the Great Depression? The stock market crash, the unemployment, the Dust Bowl? That's just the beginning. Today, I'm sharing untold stories that your grandparents might have been too proud to tell. Stories of incredible ingenuity, heartbreaking sacrifice, and the kind of resilience that built America. By the end of this video, you'll never look at food waste the same way again. You'll understand why your grandmother saved every rubber band and glass jar. And you'll discover survival strategies so clever, they could help you today. So grab your favorite snack, and trust me, you'll appreciate it more after this story. And let's travel back to one of America's most challenging decades. But first, if you love stories that bring history to life, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're just getting started, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. To understand why families were eating in shifts, we need to go back to where it all began. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. But here's what most people don't realize. The stock market crash wasn't just about rich investors losing money. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that would reach into every American kitchen, every family dinner table, every child's lunchbox. Within 3 years, unemployment skyrocketed to 25%. That's 1 in 4 adults. But here's the number that really tells the story. 13 to 15 million Americans were completely jobless. Imagine your neighborhood right now, every fourth house, empty of income, struggling to put food on the table. Let me tell you about Robert Henderson from Detroit. In 1928, he was a successful factory foreman, owned a house, had 3 kids, and took his family out for ice cream every Sunday. By 1932, he was standing in line for 3 hours hoping to get picked for a day's worth of manual labor that paid 50 cents. When he got home empty-handed, his wife Sarah had already made the decision that would define their family for the next 6 years. She announced that starting tomorrow, they would eat in shifts. But the Henderson family wasn't alone. Historians estimate that by 1933, over 2 million American families had adopted some form of shift eating to stretch their food supply. 2 million families where love was measured not by abundance, but by who was willing to go hungry so others could eat. Now, you might be thinking this sounds impossible to survive. How did they do it? How did they keep their families together? How did they find joy in such darkness? That's exactly what we're about to discover. Because Americans in the 1930s developed survival strategies so ingenious, so resourceful, they'd make today's life hackers look like amateurs. If you want to understand how America survived the Great Depression, you have to understand the women who held it all together. These were the silent heroes, the mothers, wives, and daughters who transformed impossible circumstances into somehow manageable lives. Meet Margaret Thompson from rural Kansas. Before the Depression, Margaret's biggest worry was whether to serve pot roast or chicken for Sunday dinner. By 1933, she was performing daily miracles with 50 cents, a handful of potatoes, and whatever vegetables she could coax from the drought-stricken soil behind their farmhouse. Margaret's week looked like this. Monday was laundry day, but without a washing machine, she spent 4 hours scrubbing clothes on a washboard with soap she made herself from lard and lye. Tuesday was ironing day with a heavy cast iron that had to be heated on the wood stove. She'd test the temperature by spitting on it, listening for that perfect sizzle. But here's what's incredible. Margaret wasn't just maintaining her household. She was innovating. She figured out how to make soap last twice as long by mixing it with wood ash. She discovered that corn cobs, when dried and soaked, could stretch a pot of soup to feed 6 people instead of 3. Think about the most stressful time in your life. Maybe losing a job, dealing with a major illness, or facing a financial crisis. Now imagine that stress lasting not weeks or months, but years. That's what these women faced every single day, and they didn't just survive it. They found ways to create warmth, comfort, and even joy for their families. Take haircuts, for example. Going to a barber became an impossible luxury, so families learned to cut each other's hair. But Margaret Thompson didn't just chop randomly. She practiced on her daughter's dolls first, perfecting techniques she'd read about in old magazines. Soon, she was cutting hair for half the families in her rural community, trading haircuts for eggs, milk, or vegetables. When little Jimmy Thompson came down with a fever, there was no money for a doctor. But Margaret had learned from her grandmother that willow bark tea could reduce fever, that honey and lemon could soothe a sore throat, and that a poultice made from bread and milk could draw infection from a wound. She became the neighborhood's unofficial nurse, healer, and medical advisor. These women weren't just keeping house. They were performing daily acts of heroism that often went unrecognized. They were the ones who figured out how to make children's shoes last an extra 6 months by cutting soles from old car tires. They were the ones who learned to can vegetables in jars they'd collected from neighbors, creating food stores that would last through the winter. But perhaps nowhere was their ingenuity more crucial than in the kitchen. Because when you're feeding a family of 6 on what used to feed 2, you don't just need recipes, you need miracles. And that's exactly what these remarkable women created, meal after meal, day after day. Now we get to the heart of our story, the kitchen table where American families learned that love isn't about abundance, it's about sacrifice. And nowhere was this more evident than in the revolutionary way families approached eating during the Depression. Let me tell you about the Kowalski family from Pittsburgh. Stanley Kowalski had worked in the steel mills for 15 years until the factory closed in 1931. His wife Anna was raising 4 children under the age of 12. With no income and their savings exhausted, Anna made a decision that would define their family's survival strategy. She instituted shift eating. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Anna and her 2 daughters would eat one full meal. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, Stanley and their 2 sons would eat. Sunday, if they were lucky, the whole family would share whatever food they had managed to stretch through the week. Picture Anna Kowalski on a Tuesday evening, preparing a meal she wouldn't eat, watching her husband and sons enjoy food while her own stomach ached with hunger. Picture her daughters asking why Mama wasn't eating again, and Anna's gentle explanation that she wasn't hungry right now. But here's what's remarkable. The Kowalski family wasn't unique. Government surveys from 1933 found that nearly 20% of American families had adopted some form of meal rationing or shift eating. That's over 2 million families where parents regularly went without food so their children could eat. Let's dive into the incredible strategies these families developed. Take stretching meals. This wasn't just adding water to soup. This was culinary science born from desperation. Anna Kowalski learned that 1 can of tomatoes could become the base for 7 different meals throughout the week. Monday, it was tomato soup with crackers made from flour and water. Tuesday, those same tomatoes became sauce for pasta made from just flour, eggs, when they could afford them, and salt. Wednesday, the remaining tomatoes were mixed with any available vegetables to create a stew that could simmer all day, growing more flavorful and filling as it cooked. But perhaps the most ingenious strategy was community cooking. In neighborhoods across America, families began coordinating their meals. The Kowalskis would combine their ingredients with 3 other families every Sunday, creating one large meal that fed 20 people instead of 4 separate meals for 5 people each. Let's talk about the foods that became symbols of Depression-era survival. Cabbage soup wasn't just a meal, it was a lifeline. A single head of cabbage, costing maybe 10 cents, could be turned into a pot of soup that fed a family for 3 days. You'd start with just cabbage and water, but as the days progressed, you'd add potato peelings, onion scraps, maybe a bone from last week's tiny piece of meat. Here's a recipe that Anna Kowalski perfected, written in her own hand in a notebook she kept throughout the Depression. Depression stew. 1 cup anything you have. 1 cup anything you can find. 1 cup anything your neighbors can spare. Mix with hope. Season with gratitude. Serves however many show up at your door. Now let's talk about the children. because their stories will break your heart and inspire you at the same time. 8-year-old Mary Kowalski learned to love imaginary meals, elaborate games where she and her siblings would pretend to eat feast after feast, describing every detail of imaginary turkeys, cakes, and ice cream. These weren't just games, they were psychological survival tools that helped children cope with constant hunger. Mary also learned to lie about lunch at school. When teachers asked why she didn't have a lunchbox, she'd say she'd already eaten, or that she preferred to eat when she got home. Teachers began to catch on, quietly leaving extra apples or sandwiches where hungry children could find them without embarrassment. But here's where the story gets truly remarkable. These families didn't just survive, they innovated. They created cooking techniques and recipes that were so effective, so ingenious, that many became staples of American cuisine that we still use today. You know what's amazing? Some of America's most beloved comfort foods were actually invented by families who had almost nothing. When you're forced to create something from nothing, day after day, you either give up or you become incredibly creative. American families chose creativity. Let me blow your mind with some examples. Meatloaf as we know it today? That's a Depression-era invention. Families learned that by mixing a tiny amount of ground meat with breadcrumbs, oats, and whatever vegetables they had, they could create a dish that tasted hearty and filling while using maybe a quarter pound of actual meat to feed 6 people. Take Betty Martinez from New Mexico. Betty figured out that by mixing cornmeal with a little flour and whatever fat she could find, sometimes lard, sometimes bacon grease she'd saved for weeks, she could create tortillas that were more filling than bread and cost half as much to make. Betty's tortilla recipe spread through her neighborhood, then across the Southwest, helping families stretch their food budgets. But here's what really shows the human spirit. Even when families were eating in shifts, even when there was barely enough food for survival, they still found ways to create treats for their children. Betty learned to make depression cake, a chocolate cake with no milk, no eggs, and no butter. Just flour, cocoa powder, sugar when available, and water. Kids couldn't tell the difference, and more importantly, it gave parents a way to celebrate birthdays and special occasions even in the darkest times. Let's talk about gardens, because this is where Depression-era ingenuity really shines. When the Martinez family's small backyard couldn't produce enough vegetables, Betty convinced 5 neighboring families to pool their resources. They took over an empty lot, creating the neighborhood's first community garden. But this wasn't just planting vegetables and hoping for the best. These families developed sophisticated systems. They learned companion planting, how tomatoes grow better next to basil, how beans can provide nitrogen for corn, how marigolds keep pests away from vegetables. They created composting systems using kitchen scraps that would otherwise be wasted, turning garbage into rich soil. Betty Martinez also mastered food preservation techniques that kept her family fed through the winter. She learned to can vegetables in jars she collected from neighbors, creating a pantry that could last 6 months. She discovered that by burying root vegetables in sand in her basement, they would stay fresh until spring. Perhaps most impressively, Betty helped establish a neighborhood barter system. She traded her canned tomatoes for the Johnson family's eggs. The Johnsons traded eggs for the Murphy family's milk. The Murphys traded milk for the Williams family's bread. No money changed hands, but everyone ate better than they would have alone. And let's not forget the children's contributions. 10-year-old Roberto Martinez became an expert at finding edible plants that grew wild dandelion greens for salads, wild onions for flavoring, berries that could be turned into jam. These weren't just children playing in nature. They were essential members of the family's survival team. Here's something that will amaze you. Many of the sustainability practices that are trending today, composting, community gardens, eating seasonal and local foods, preserving your own vegetables, these were all standard practices for Depression-era families. They weren't choosing these practices for environmental reasons. They were choosing them for survival. But the result was a way of living that was incredibly sustainable and self-sufficient. Now, you might be wondering, how did communities come together to help each other? Because individual family ingenuity was only part of the story. The other part was how neighbors, churches, and communities created support systems that helped everyone survive together. Here's something that might surprise you about the Great Depression. It was also the era when American communities became strongest. When individual families couldn't make it alone, something beautiful happened. People remembered that they were stronger together. Let me tell you about Elm Street in Columbus, Ohio, in 1934. On this one street lived the Thompson family, unemployed factory worker, the Chun family whose laundry business had failed, the O'Brien family, farmer who'd lost his land, and the Williams family, whose father was working part-time for 60% less than his previous salary. Here's what these families created together: the Elm Street Survival Cooperative. Every Sunday, they'd pool their resources. The Thompsons would contribute whatever vegetables they'd managed to grow. The Chens shared their knowledge of making clothes last longer and their skill at mending. The O'Briens brought their farming expertise and helped everyone maximize their small garden plots. The Williams family shared their single working radio, which became the neighborhood's source of news and entertainment. But this cooperative went far beyond sharing resources. They created a rotating childcare system so that adults could spend full days looking for work without worrying about their children. They established a tool library where families could borrow hammers, saws, and other equipment instead of everyone needing to own everything. They created a clothing exchange where children's outgrown clothes could be passed to families with smaller children. Churches became absolutely crucial during this time, not just for spiritual support but as practical organizing centers. St. Mary's Catholic Church in downtown Columbus started serving what they called community dinners every Tuesday and Thursday evening. These weren't charity handouts. They were community events where every family contributed something, even if it was just helping with setup or cleanup. Father McKenna, the parish priest, was brilliant about preserving people's dignity. Instead of creating a soup kitchen where people lined up for charity, he created community potluck dinners, where everyone brought something to share. A family might bring just a single can of beans, but they were contributing, not just receiving. This psychological difference was crucial for maintaining people's self-respect during incredibly difficult times. Communities also became centers for skill sharing. Mrs. Chun taught neighborhood women how to alter clothes to fit different family members. Mr. O'Brien taught urban families how to grow vegetables in small spaces. Mrs. Williams, who had been a nurse before marriage, provided basic health care for families who couldn't afford doctors. Even children played important community roles. They created neighborhood networks for sharing news, finding odd jobs, and looking out for elderly neighbors. 12-year-old Tommy Thompson organized the neighborhood kids into a message service that helped adults communicate about job opportunities, shared meals, and community events. When President Roosevelt's New Deal programs began, these existing community networks became crucial for their success. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, didn't just create jobs. It worked with communities like Elm Street to identify the most needed projects and the most capable workers. The men from Elm Street joined WPA crews that built the Columbus Municipal Airport, constructed new school buildings, and created Whetstone Park, which still exists today. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't just work alongside each other. They continued their cooperative spirit, sharing transportation to work sites, pooling resources to buy better work clothes, and supporting families whose members were still looking for work. The women created what they called Victory Gardens years before World War II made the term popular. They organized neighborhood-wide efforts to plant vegetables in every available space: backyards, vacant lots, even strips of land along railroad tracks. By 1935, the Elm Street neighborhood was producing 60% of its own vegetables, dramatically reducing food costs for every family. Here's something beautiful. Many of these Depression-era communities remained close for decades afterward. The families on Elm Street continued their Sunday dinners long after the economic crisis ended. Children who grew up sharing resources and supporting neighbors became adults who built stronger, more connected communities throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. What can we learn from these communities today? How did their strategies work? And what made the difference between communities that thrived and those that struggled? That's exactly what we need to explore next. Now here's something that will completely change how you think about happiness. Families who were eating in shifts, wearing patched clothes, and sharing single rooms for warmth somehow found ways to create joy, laughter, and cherished memories. How is that possible? Let me tell you about the evening entertainment in the Johnson household in rural Tennessee. Every night after their simple dinner, Whether it was their eating shift or not, the family would gather around their battery-powered radio. This radio was their most precious possession, more valuable than furniture, more treasured than jewelry. At 7 p.m., they'd tune in to Amos and Andy, a comedy show that had the whole family laughing together. At 8 p.m. came The Shadow, a mystery program that had everyone on the edge of their seats. And on Sunday evenings, they'd listen to musical programs that featured the era's greatest performers. But here's what's beautiful. The radio didn't just provide entertainment. It created rituals that bound the family together. 10-year-old Sarah Johnson would curl up against her father's shoulder while they listened. 8-year-old David would act out the dramatic scenes they heard. Mama Johnson would darn socks while listening, and Papa Johnson would whittle small toys for the children. When the radio wasn't on, these families created their own entertainment. Board games became incredibly popular during the Depression, but most families couldn't afford store-bought games, so they made their own. The Johnson family created elaborate card games using homemade cards cut from cardboard and decorated with pencil drawings. Here's something ironic and wonderful. Monopoly, the board game about buying property and getting rich, became wildly popular during the Depression when most families had no money. Why? Because it allowed people to dream, to experience wealth and success in a safe, playful way. Families would spend entire evenings playing Monopoly, temporarily escaping into a world where money was abundant and opportunities were everywhere. Children developed incredibly rich imaginative play during this era. Without store-bought toys, they created elaborate scenarios with simple objects. Empty tin cans became drums for neighborhood bands. Sticks and stones became building materials for miniature cities. Old clothes became costumes for theatrical performances that entertained entire neighborhoods. Communities organized entertainment events that cost nothing but created lasting memories. Church basement dances where teenagers learned to waltz and swing dance to music played on donated instruments. Neighborhood talent shows where families showcased hidden abilities, singing, storytelling, comedy routines, musical performances. Seasonal celebrations became especially important because they provided something to anticipate and prepare for. Christmas during the Depression wasn't about expensive gifts, it was about creativity and thoughtfulness. Families made gifts by hand, carved wooden toys, knitted scarves, homemade preserves, hand-copied books of favorite recipes or stories. Birthday celebrations required incredible creativity. Instead of expensive cakes and presents, families created traditions around storytelling, special meals prepared with carefully saved ingredients, and gifts that were made rather than bought. A child might receive a hand-sewn doll, a wooden toy carved by father, or a notebook made from scrap paper for drawing and writing. Music became incredibly important during the Depression. Families would gather around a piano if they had one, or simply sing together without instrumental accompaniment. They'd teach children traditional songs, create new lyrics to familiar tunes, and use music as a way to express emotions that were too difficult to discuss directly. Storytelling reached an art form during the Depression. Parents and grandparents became master storytellers, creating elaborate tales that entertained children night after night. These stories often featured brave children overcoming difficulties, magical solutions to real-world problems, and heroes who succeeded through cleverness rather than wealth. Public libraries became havens for families during the Depression. Libraries were warm, free, and offered endless entertainment through books, magazines, and newspapers. Families would spend entire afternoons at the library, with children listening to story hours while parents read about job opportunities, farming techniques, or simply escaped into novels. Outdoor activities became important sources of free entertainment. Families would take long walks together, exploring their neighborhoods and nearby natural areas. Children learned games that required no equipment: hide and seek, tag, jumping games, singing games that could entertain groups for hours. What strikes me most about Depression-era entertainment is how it created hope. These families weren't just passing time. They were actively creating joy, strengthening relationships, and building memories that would sustain them through the darkest days. They proved that happiness doesn't require wealth. It requires intention, creativity, and connection with others. Now let's talk about something that changed everything: When the federal government realized that individual communities, no matter how strong and creative, needed help on a scale that had never been attempted in American history. This is the story of how President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal didn't just provide jobs. It restored something even more precious: hope. Remember Stanley Kowalski from Pittsburgh, whose family was eating in shifts? In 1935, something changed his life forever. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, offered him a job building a new school in his neighborhood. For the first time in 4 years, Stanley would receive a steady paycheck. But here's what's remarkable. His first act wasn't to buy food for himself. It was to tell his wife Anna that starting tomorrow, the whole family could eat together again. The WPA wasn't just about employment, it was about dignity. Men who had been standing in unemployment lines, feeling worthless and ashamed, suddenly had purpose again. They were building schools, hospitals, bridges, and parks that would serve their communities for generations. Stanley Kowalski helped build Hillcrest Elementary School, and 50 years later, he would walk his granddaughter to that same school on her first day of kindergarten. Let me tell you about 18-year-old James Murphy from rural Oklahoma, whose family had lost their farm in the Dust Bowl. James joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, a New Deal program that employed young men in environmental conservation projects. James was sent to Colorado, where he spent 2 years planting trees, building hiking trails, and constructing fire lookout towers. But here's what changed James's life. The CCC didn't just give him a job, it gave him education. In the evenings, CCC camps offered literacy classes, vocational training, and even high school courses. James, who had dropped out of school in 8th grade to help on the family farm, earned his high school diploma at age 20 while building trails in Rocky Mountain National Park. The government programs also provided crucial support for families. Aid to dependent children helped single mothers and families where the father was too ill to work. Social Security, introduced in 1935, gave elderly Americans the security of knowing they wouldn't be destitute in their old age. For farming families devastated by the Dust Bowl, the government provided both immediate relief and long-term solutions. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration helped farmers learn new techniques for preventing soil erosion. The Resettlement Administration helped farming families move to areas where they could rebuild their lives. But perhaps most importantly, New Deal programs built infrastructure that transformed communities. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to rural areas that had never had power. The Public Works Administration built hospitals, schools, and community centers that became the hearts of their neighborhoods. Here's something you might not know. The New Deal also funded cultural programs. The Federal Writers Project employed authors to document American life and create guidebooks for every state. The Federal Theater Project brought live performances to communities that had never seen professional theater. The Federal Art Project created murals in post offices and public buildings across the country. These programs did more than provide immediate relief. They changed how Americans thought about government and community responsibility. Before the Depression, most Americans believed that individuals and families should handle their own problems. The New Deal established the principle that the government has a responsibility to help citizens during national emergencies. Of course, these programs weren't universally popular. Many Americans, particularly those who hadn't lost everything, worried about the cost and the expansion of federal power. Some people felt that government assistance would make Americans lazy or dependent. These debates shaped American politics for decades to come. But for families like the Kowalskis, the Murphys, and millions of others, New Deal programs restored something precious: the belief that hard work could lead to a better future. Stanley Kowalski didn't just earn a paycheck from the WPA. He regained his role as family provider, his sense of contributing to society, his hope that his children would have opportunities he didn't. The New Deal programs didn't just help Americans survive the Great Depression. They fundamentally changed American society. The safety net they created, the infrastructure they built, and the precedent they established for federal responsibility continue to influence American life today. But what lasting changes did the Depression era create in how Americans think about family, community, and survival? Here's something that will absolutely amaze you. If you've ever wondered why your grandmother saved every glass jar, why your grandfather could fix anything with duct tape and determination, or why older Americans get genuinely upset about food waste, You're seeing the lasting impact of Depression-era survival strategies that were passed down through generations. Let me paint a picture for you. Sarah Johnson, the little girl who used to curl up against her father's shoulder listening to radio programs, grew up to become a grandmother who taught her grandchildren lessons she learned during the Depression. She showed them how to make soap from kitchen scraps, how to grow vegetables in tiny spaces, how to mend clothes so carefully that the patches became decorations rather than signs of poverty. But Sarah's lessons went deeper than practical skills. She taught her grandchildren that throwing away food was almost sinful, not for religious reasons, but because she remembered when families ate in shifts and every grain of rice was precious. She taught them to value community over individual success, because she remembered when neighbors sharing resources meant the difference between survival and starvation. Psychologists have identified something called inherited trauma, but there's also inherited resilience. Children who grew up during the Depression didn't just pass down their pain. They passed down their incredible problem-solving abilities, their appreciation for simple pleasures, and their understanding of what truly matters in life. Take the Martinez family today. Roberto Martinez, whose grandmother Betty was the community garden innovator I told you about earlier, runs a successful sustainable farming business in New Mexico. He didn't learn farming techniques from college courses. He learned them from his grandmother, who learned them from necessity during the Depression. Betty's community garden strategies became Roberto's business model. Here's what's remarkable. Families that survived the Depression together often maintain stronger connections across generations. The shared experience of overcoming extreme hardship created bonds that lasted for decades. Grandchildren who never experienced hunger themselves grew up understanding the value of every meal because their grandparents had experienced real starvation. Many practices that are trending today as sustainable living or minimalism were standard survival techniques for Depression-era families. Community gardens, composting, buying local produce, mending clothes instead of replacing them, choosing quality over quantity. These weren't lifestyle choices in the 1930s, they were survival necessities. Depression-era families also passed down financial wisdom that many modern families desperately need. They understood the importance of emergency savings, the danger of debt, the value of owning useful skills that can't be taken away by economic downturns. Children who grew up during the Depression often became adults who were prepared for economic uncertainty. Perhaps most importantly, Depression-era communities passed down an understanding of how to build strong social networks. They knew that individual families, no matter how strong, needed community support systems. They understood that helping others during good times meant you'd have help during difficult times. Today's most resilient communities often reflect Depression-era principles. Neighborhoods with strong community gardens, active mutual aid networks, and traditions of sharing resources tend to be places where Depression-era values were passed down and adapted for modern circumstances. Some families maintained Depression-era traditions long after they were economically necessary. Sunday family dinners, community potluck events, seasonal canning and preservation activities, and extended family gatherings became ways of maintaining the connections and values that had helped families survive their most difficult times. The stories themselves became incredibly valuable. Grandparents who told their grandchildren about eating in shifts, about finding joy during the darkest times, about neighbors helping each other survive, were passing down more than family history. They were teaching resilience, gratitude, and the importance of community. These lessons became especially relevant during more recent challenges. Families with strong Depression-era traditions often handled the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and other modern difficulties more successfully because they had inherited both practical skills and psychological resilience from earlier generations. The question for us today is, what are we passing down to the next generation? Are we teaching them the same resilience, creativity, and community values that helped our ancestors survive America's greatest economic crisis? Or are we raising children who might not know how to find joy in simple things, how to create something from nothing, or how to come together with neighbors during difficult times? Now I need to tell you about one of the most heartbreaking and inspiring chapters of Depression-era survival, the Great Migrations. We've talked about families eating in shifts, but imagine being forced to abandon everything you've ever known and walk away with only what you can carry, hoping to find a better life hundreds of miles away. Meet the Crawford family from Guymon, Oklahoma. In 1935, Tom Crawford owned 160 acres of wheat farm that his grandfather had homesteaded in the 1890s. The land had fed 3 generations of Crawfords. But by April 1935, that same land was buried under 6 feet of dust, and the family was facing a choice: stay and starve, or abandon everything and head west. Picture this: dust storms so massive they turned day into night. Dust so fine it seeped through every crack, covering food, filling lungs, killing livestock. Mary Crawford would wet sheets and hang them over the windows, but dust still filled their house. Their children developed what they called dust pneumonia. Crops died. Animals died. Hope was dying too. Tom Crawford made the hardest decision of his life on May 15, 1935. He sold everything he couldn't carry: farm equipment, furniture, even the family piano that his wife had played every evening after dinner. They used that money to buy a used Ford truck and supplies for the journey to California, where they'd heard there was work in the fruit orchards. The Crawford family's journey took 3 weeks and covered over 1,300 miles. They slept in the truck, cooked over campfires, and bathed in rivers when they could find them. 8-year-old Lucy Crawford later remembered that trip as an adventure, but her parents remembered it as the most terrifying time of their lives. When they reached California, the Crawfords discovered they weren't alone. Thousands of other families had made the same journey, and there wasn't enough work for everyone. The fruit orchards that had promised steady employment were overwhelmed with desperate workers willing to work for almost nothing. The Crawford family ended up in a migrant worker camp outside Bakersfield, a collection of tents, makeshift shacks, and families living in their cars. There was no running water, no electricity, and no sanitation facilities for the hundreds of families crowded together. But here's what's amazing. Even in these desperate conditions, families found ways to create community, share resources, and maintain dignity. Mary Crawford organized a camp school where older children taught younger ones basic reading and math. Tom Crawford and other men worked together to dig wells and build latrines. Families shared cooking fires and took turns watching each other's children. They created a small community postal system so families could receive letters from relatives back home. The children in these camps showed incredible adaptability. Lucy Crawford learned Spanish from Mexican migrant families, developing language skills that would serve her throughout her life. She learned to identify edible plants and helped her family supplement their diet with food they could find growing wild. Most importantly, she learned that home wasn't a place. It was the people you loved, wherever you happened to be. The Crawford family worked in fruit orchards, vegetable fields, and cotton farms, following the crops from season to season. They earned maybe $2 a day when work was available, which meant they still had to employ the same eating-in shift strategy they'd used back in Oklahoma. But they were working, they were moving forward, and they were together. Here's the remarkable part of the Crawford family story. By 1940, they had saved enough money to rent a small house in Fresno, California. Tom found steady work in a defense plant as World War II approached. Lucy Crawford eventually became a teacher, inspired by the camp school her mother had organized. The family that had lost everything managed to rebuild their lives from nothing. The stories of families like the Crawfords were powerfully documented by photographers like Dorothea Lange and writers like John Steinbeck. Lange's photograph, Migrant Mother, became one of the most famous images in American history, showing the worried face of a mother trying to keep her family together during impossible circumstances. The federal government eventually responded to the migrant crisis by building better camps with improved sanitation, schools, and medical facilities. The Farm Security Administration created programs to help migrant families find steady work and permanent housing. But for years, families like the Crawfords survived through their own resourcefulness and the support they gave each other. The stories of Dust Bowl migrants remind us that throughout American history, families have been forced to leave their homes in search of better opportunities. The courage, creativity, and community-building skills that families like the Crawfords developed during their migrations continue to inspire people facing similar challenges today. Now let me tell you about the most heartbreaking and inspiring part of this entire story. The children. Kids who should have been playing with toys were instead learning to patch shoes with tire rubber. Children who should have been worried about homework were instead worried about whether their family would have enough food for dinner. But these children didn't just survive. They developed wisdom, resilience, and capabilities that many adults never achieve. Meet 9-year-old Dorothy Hamilton from Detroit. In 1933, Dorothy's father lost his job at the Ford Motor Company. Her mother took in laundry to earn a few dollars a week, but it wasn't enough. Dorothy became the family's chief resource finder, walking through neighborhoods looking for discarded items that could be useful, bottles that could be returned for deposits, cardboard that could be used for insulation, scraps of cloth that could be sewn into patches. But Dorothy's contributions went far beyond scavenging. She learned to care for her 3 younger siblings while her parents looked for work. She could prepare basic meals, mend clothes, and keep the house clean. By age 10, she was essentially running the household for hours each day, allowing her parents to focus on finding income. School became complicated for children like Dorothy. She often arrived at school hungry, wearing patched clothes and shoes that didn't quite fit. But teachers during the Depression were remarkably resourceful and compassionate. Dorothy's teacher, Miss Anderson, quietly kept extra sandwiches in her desk and found ways to give them to hungry children without embarrassing them. Even play became more creative and resourceful during the Depression. Dorothy and her friends created elaborate games using nothing but imagination. They built playhouses from cardboard boxes and furnished them with furniture made from smaller boxes and scraps of fabric. They created dolls from corn husks and dressed them in clothes sewn from fabric remnants. Children during the Depression developed skills that many adults today would find challenging. 10-year-old boys knew how to repair bicycles, mend shoes, and grow vegetables. 10-year-old girls could cook complete meals, preserve food for winter storage, and manage household budgets. These weren't exceptional children. These were ordinary kids who rose to meet extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps most remarkably, Depression-era children developed emotional maturity that helped them support their parents during incredibly stressful times. Dorothy Hamilton learned to recognize when her father was feeling hopeless about finding work, and she'd suggest activities or games that would cheer him up. She understood that her parents were doing their best in impossible circumstances, and she never complained about the sacrifices her childhood required. Children also played important roles in community survival networks. They served as messengers, carrying news about job opportunities, shared meals, and community events. They organized themselves into informal groups that looked out for elderly neighbors, ran errands for families with sick members, and helped maintain community gardens. While we would never want children to experience the hardships of the Depression, those children learned lessons that served them throughout their lives. They understood the value of everything they had, the importance of hard work, and the power of family and community support. They learned that happiness comes from relationships and achievements, not from possessions. Take 12-year-old Robert Chin, whose family's laundry business failed in 1932. Robert learned to speak English by listening to radio programs, taught himself to read by studying newspapers he found discarded on the street, and earned money for his family by selling pencils he made from newspaper rolled around graphite he found at construction sites. Robert's resourcefulness helped keep his family fed and housed until his father found new work. Children who grew up during the Depression often became adults with exceptional problem-solving abilities, strong family values, and deep appreciation for stability and security. They understood that prosperity could disappear quickly, so they developed habits of saving, sharing, and preparing for uncertainty that served them well throughout their lives. Many Depression-era children later said that despite the hardships, they had rich, meaningful childhoods. They remembered the closeness of their families, the strength of their communities, and the satisfaction of contributing to their family's survival. They learned that they were capable of far more than they might have imagined, and that knowledge gave them confidence that lasted their entire lives. When we compare Depression-era childhoods with modern childhood experiences, we see both gains and losses. Today's children have more material security, better education, and more opportunities, but they might have fewer chances to develop the self-reliance, resourcefulness, and deep family bonds that came naturally to children who grew up during America's most challenging decade. So what can modern families learn from these Depression-era children? How can we help today's kids develop resilience, gratitude, and problem-solving skills without exposing them to genuine hardship. And what would these Depression-era families think about the way we live today? Here's a thought experiment that will absolutely blow your mind. What would a Depression-era family think if they could see how we live today? What would Dorothy Hamilton think about children who have their own smartphones? What would the Kowalski family think about restaurants that throw away tons of food every day? Let's take this journey through their eyes. First, let's talk about food. Anna Kowalski, who carefully planned meals for her family's eating shifts, would be absolutely stunned by modern food waste. Americans today throw away about 40% of the food we produce. That's 80 billion pounds of food annually. Anna would see families throwing away leftovers that could have fed her entire neighborhood for a week. But it wouldn't just be the waste that would shock Depression-era families. It would be the incredible abundance. Tom Crawford, who sold his family piano to buy supplies for their migration to California, would walk through a modern grocery store in complete amazement. Tropical fruits available year-round, dozens of cereal options, entire aisles devoted to snacks and convenience foods. Margaret Thompson, who spent 4 hours every Monday doing laundry by hand, would be fascinated by washing machines and dryers. But she might also worry about what skills modern families would lose if they never had to figure out how to create cleanliness from basic soap and determination. Dorothy Hamilton, who managed her household at age 9, might be concerned about modern children who struggle with basic life skills. She'd wonder how kids who can operate sophisticated technology might not know how to prepare a simple meal, mend a piece of clothing, or grow food from seeds. The Elm Street cooperative families would be amazed by modern technology's ability to connect people across vast distances, but they might worry about the loss of daily, face-to-face community interactions. They'd wonder how neighbors can live next to each other for years without knowing each other's names, let alone being willing to share resources during difficult times. Depression-era families would have mixed reactions to modern financial systems. They'd be amazed by the safety nets that exist today: unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare, food assistance programs. But they'd also be deeply concerned about consumer debt levels, the complexity of modern financial products, and how many families live paycheck to paycheck despite earning more money than Depression-era families could have imagined. Stanley Kowalski, who walked miles looking for any available work, would be amazed by modern job opportunities and worker protections. But he might also be puzzled by modern work stress, the idea that people could be unhappy with well-paying jobs, or that work-life balance could be a source of anxiety rather than gratitude. Depression-era parents, who valued education but often couldn't afford to keep their children in school, would be astounded by modern educational opportunities. Free public education through high school, college loans and grants, online learning opportunities, vocational training programs. They'd see these as incredible gifts that many modern families might take for granted. Families who relied on folk remedies and couldn't afford doctors would be amazed by modern healthcare capabilities. Vaccines that prevent diseases that killed children in the 1930s, antibiotics that cure infections, surgical procedures that save lives, mental health support that was completely unavailable during the Depression. But Depression-era families might also worry about modern resilience. They'd wonder, if modern families faced the challenges of the 1930s, would they have the skills, community connections, and psychological toughness to survive and thrive? Or have we become so accustomed to convenience and abundance that we've lost some essential survival capabilities? On the other hand, Depression-era families would celebrate many aspects of modern life. Civil rights advances that gave opportunities to people who were excluded in the 1930s. Women's expanded roles and opportunities. Environmental protections that prevent disasters like the Dust Bowl. Social safety nets that prevent families from falling into complete destitution. Depression-era families would probably want modern families to preserve certain values. Appreciation for what you have, willingness to help neighbors, ability to find joy in simple pleasures, understanding that families are stronger when they face challenges together, and knowledge that material possessions are less important than relationships and character. If Depression-era families could teach modern families just 3 lessons, they might be: first, learn skills that don't depend on technology or money: cooking, gardening, mending, basic healthcare. Second, build relationships with neighbors and community members before you need help, because you never know when circumstances might change. Third, Practice gratitude daily for abundance that previous generations couldn't have imagined. But here's the most important question. We can't go back to the 1930s, and we wouldn't want to recreate the genuine suffering of that era. So how do we take the best lessons from Depression-era resilience and apply them to our modern lives? How do we build the strength, community connections, and appreciation for simple joys that helped our ancestors survive their darkest times? And that's the untold story of how America ate in shifts, and how families found ways to not just survive, but to love, laugh, and hope together during the darkest of times. Before you go, I want you to think about this. Which story from today's video will you remember tomorrow? Which lesson might change how you think about your own challenges? And what would you want to tell these Depression-era families about how their sacrifices helped create the world we live in today? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Maybe you have your own family stories from the Great Depression. Maybe your grandparents shared memories that connect with what we've talked about today. Maybe you've been inspired to try some of these Depression-era strategies in your own life.